I'd like to welcome all of you to the third annual joint FOIL CDL presentation titled ESG Comes to America. Our goal is to explain how a greenwashing claim can be international in scope, how it can bring a company to its knees, how an effective D&O program can be a corporate lifeline, how creative tech solutions offer a transformative and lucrative path forward in a low-carbon economy, and how a negotiated resolution of competing claims can be in everyone's interest. Joining me is an international panel to discuss this problem, starting with Laura Cook. Laura is a partner with Clyde & Co. in London. Zelda Pittman. Zelda is the Client Executive Management Liability Officer at Marsh Limited in London. Andrew Downs is a shareholder at Bullivant Hauser Bailey PC in San Francisco, California. And John Pacerich is the Executive Vice President, Environmental Health and Safety Practice Lead at JS Held LLC in New Orleans, Louisiana.
So I get the opportunity as the local oil and gasser to tell you a little bit about the tale of Big Texas Oil. Big Texas Oil is a Midland, Texas-based oil and gas company that's engaged in the acquisition and development of conventional onshore oil and gas resources. Their 2002 revenue was $866.74 million. They are a very successful oil and gas company, and a few years ago decided to be listed as a publicly issuer on both the New York Stock Exchange and the Toronto Stock Exchange. Most of BTO's wells are in the Permian Basin, and they're spread throughout the basin. It is the highest producing oil field in the United States. It has both natural gas, which is usually associated with almost every oil producing region. The natural gas actually sits on top of the oil. In some cases, including in the Permian Basin, that gas contains high levels of hydrogen sulfide, which is toxic. It has to be managed. And there are regulatory programs around the management of both the oil and gas industry itself and also the hydrogen sulfide as it's produced. Flaring is common. It is common throughout the Permian Basin because there's limited natural gas pipeline available to producers in the area. It's just not economical to transport those gases, and so they're flared, as I mentioned earlier. Big Texas Oil is aware of that as an issue. They have managed it as others in the industry do, and it is what we would consider an industry norm at this point. They routinely manage those resources in a way that is similar to everyone else and could be considered a traditional oil and gas company in Texas.
I'm Andy Downs. I'm going to be somewhat out of character today since I normally represent insurance companies, and I'm going to be the representative of the in-house policyholder lawyer for Big Texas Oil, although I am not a Texan, and in fact, I'm thousands of miles away from Texas. With that, Big Texas Oil, like most entities, relies on its bank for operating credit. In this case, its bank is Chase. In 2021, when it came time to renew its terms, Chase, like many financial institutions in North America, put great pressure on Big Texas Oil to become ESG compliant. And the lending agreement required that Big Texas Oil do certain things. But at the same time, Big Texas Oil was making a lot of money. Slide, Heather. And it made record profits in 2022. It was a double or triple the 2021 years, which were very good. And it didn't actually do anything towards decarbonizing in either 2021 or 2022. It had very good intentions, but it was treating the decarbonizing process somewhat like a New Year's resolution. But it did, however, make a statement in its various governmental filings. And the statement was BTO's goal is to become a net zero emissions energy business by 2050. In step with our industry and society as a whole, our short, medium, and long-term targets are consistent with that ambitious but essential goal. Unfortunately, that statement was not literally true. BTO did not actually do anything. However, when it went to New York to renew its lines of credits, its chairman repeated that statement, a face-to-face statement with representatives of Chase. It was certainly aspirational. It was not true, however. Heather?
A Canadian pension fund with offices in Toronto was really impressed with the stated efforts of BTO to go green, to be an oil and gas company in a low carbon economy. And looking for that particular entity, it invested a significant portion of a particular pension fund in BTO on the Toronto Stock Exchange. And then, as it was so impressed, it repeated BTO's statement in its annual report, its 2023 annual report. Greenpeace USA heard of this statement in the 2023 annual report of BTO, and it filed a complaints with the United States, or sorry, it wrote I'm getting ahead of myself in the story. It sent a letter to BTO's Chief Financial Officer and General Counsel and said, your annual report does not contain any audited performance indicators as to how it's going to actually affect this goal. We do not believe that there's substance to it unless we get known performance indicators by the end of the year. We are going to file complaints to the United States Federal Trade Commission and to the United States Securities Commission. It copied that letter to Greenpeace Canada. 6 residents of British Columbia, all directors of Greenpeace Canada, filed a complaint against the pension fund with the Canadian Competition Bureau. That is a big deal because it's an offense under the Competition Act of Canada for a person to make a representation knowingly or recklessly to the public that's false or misleading in a material respect for the purpose of promoting a business. Upon conviction, a court can impose a fine or imprisonment of up to 14 years or both. There's also civil consequences. If the commissioner finds that the general impression of the statement was false or misleading, and the standard is an ordinary, hurried consumer and how they would perceive it, then the commission may impose a penalty of the greater of 10 million or 3 times the benefit that the pension fund received from the statement. As I said, that's a big deal. The pension fund hired me to represent its interests in this situation, knowing that legal liability was on the doorstep. I had a frantic call from the director of investment of the pension fund, who was completely alarmed about the possibility of imprisonment. I tried to assure that that's very rare, but nonetheless, it's in the legislation. And the reputation of the pension fund, all of it. And just laid this on my doorstep. And after the call, I was just brainstorming. What are my issues and how am I going to deal with them? Unfortunately, it definitely appears that the pension fund has issued a false and misleading statement. It has a claim over BTO, but where? Do we file in Texas state court? Do we file in federal court? Will the federal court accept jurisdiction? Are we best to stay in Ontario? Pension fund itself is exposed to claims by pensioners for mismanagement of funds. We must notify our fidelity insurers as well as our D&O. Because of the reputational risk, it would be optimal to resolve all of this outside of the public eye. But in the meantime, I need to be a thorn in BTO's side. They need to know that we are angry as heck up here and that we need to get this resolved. So I call the General Counsel of Big Texas Oil and I have a video chat with their counsel and their CFO. I set it all out for them. And I tell them that we're going to have to come after you, and we're considering filing in the Ontario Superior Court.
And at that point, they hire me. And the one thing I agree with Heather on is that we'd like to keep this as non-public as possible. Not that that's necessarily achievable, but there's, as you can see on the slides, there's a number of issues. First of all, we're looking at liability on multiple fronts. We're likely in breach of our lending agreement with Chase, which means, of course, they can declare the loan in default and demand immediate repayment of all sums, which will probably have an adverse effect on our solvency. There is personal exposure to the directors and officers. Do we need to notify the D&O insurer? I think that's probably the dumbest question of the day, because the answer is heck yes. Of course, we need to notify the D&O insurer. What are our limits? What is the retention? Which coverage applies? And I need to be clear. This is an important issue from the ethical perspective for the attorneys. I represent the company. I only represent the company. I do not represent the directors and the officers, because the interests of the directors and the officers may be distinctly different than the interest of the company, even if the company is obligated to indemnify them against their potential liability. Everybody, this is where you run into the danger that everybody starts pointing fingers at everyone else. And the directors and officers suddenly become remarkably uninformed about what the company was doing with, well, we thought they were doing that. We told them to do it. We expected them to do it. They didn't tell us that, oh no, that'll knock, 50 cents a share off our profits, and that would hurt our stock value. So we didn't do it. There's a lot of factors going in here that make life very, very difficult. And this is one of those situations where, as outside counsel for a policyholder in this kind of position, the first thing that you're trying to do is simply to keep a bad situation from getting worse, because it's already bad. You've already lost. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Zelda to talk about the insurance coverage that my client was wise enough to purchase.
Yeah, so BTO, in common with pretty much all publicly listed companies, I think, would have purchased directors and officers liability insurance. So I'll just explain what that covers. So although you can see there's the two central bits there where it says cover claims against directors and officers, this is really an all risks policy for the directors and officers of Big Texas Oil. So that's all people who sit on the board of director, plus probably several senior managers, people like the risk officer. And they would all be covered on a personal basis. So any claims that name the directors and officers of Big Texas Oil, whether those are civil, criminal, regulatory investigations are also covered for individuals, and any other allegations of wrongdoing. And it is a very broad all risks cover that would protect them for defence costs, expert fees, other expenses that might be incurred, as well as any fines that are insurable at law, and damages payout. So that is the nature of the individual insurance offered by a directors and officers insurance policy. BTO itself is only covered to the extent, as in its own liability, is only covered for claims by securities holders, so shareholders of the company. So that bit of the policy, the bit that protects BTO's losses, is more limited. It's just securities class actions and shareholder derivative claims and those sorts of claims brought by shareholders. Now, we call these different names, even though you'll very rarely see side A, side B, or side C in a policy wording. Side C is the securities claims cover against directors against BTO that I just described. Side A and side B are just two sides of the same coin. So this is the protection for the directors and officers and individuals at the company. Normally, if a director or officer of a company gets sued for something they've done, some wrongful act they've committed whilst they're working at the company itself will indemnify them. They'll pick up their defence costs, they'll support them, they'll back them, they may even pay damages or fines if they can. And in that case, the company will make a claim under the D&O policy to the extent it has indemnified its directors and officers. If the company does that, it has to pay a retention. And that retention is also payable for the securities claims under side C. However, there might be cases where a company has run out of money, it's insolvent, or as Andy was just saying, there may be a conflict of interest between the directors and the company doesn't want to pay their defence costs. And in that case, the director's kind of all on their own and they've got all these claims against them. And that's what side A is for. So side A is, there's no retention for side A claims, so it's a ground up cover. And the directors and officers would go straight to the insurance company to seek reimbursement under the D&O policy. If we go to the next slide, please. So as I was just describing, you've got the retention for side B and side C claims only, no retention for side A. And also BTO would have purchased as probably a quite significant policy limit. So in this case, it's a 70 million limit, but 10 million of that is only for the individual directors who are not being indemnified by their company. So there's an additional 10 million just of side A cover. And the reason why many companies will buy an additional limit of side A protection is because once the limit is exhausted, and although 70 million sounds like a lot of money, if you have claims on multiple fronts like you have here, so misrepresentation allegations, regulatory investigations, shareholder derivative action, which may then lead to securities class action, that limit can be eroded a lot. And all of those claims are arising out of the same misrepresentation. So they're all going to just stack on top of each other and slowly take away that limit. And obviously, once the limit is exhausted, BTO may well have deep pockets. They can, turn to their asset sheet. But individuals are alone. So that's why we often buy ring fence cover for individuals who aren't being indemnified by their insurance policy, that the company itself can't access. So that isn't for indemnified claims and it's not for securities claims, it's just for individuals who aren't being indemnified. And in this case, DIC or difference in conditions cover has also been bought, and that means that it will drop down and fill in any gaps in the insurance lower layers. So if one of those insurers goes bankrupt or denies cover for any reason, the side A will drop down and fill in the gap so that individuals who are self-funding don't find themselves exposed. So the next step, once... Yeah. Oh.
No, that's okay. When you're ready.
When you're ready, let me know.
Will do. So the next step, once you receive a call from a client or their representatives saying a load of claims have come in, which sadly does happen, is to notify insurers. You really should not incur any costs until you have insurers' written consent to incurring those costs if you're expecting them to pay them. Similarly, you must not admit any liability or enter into any settlement agreements. and all claims or circumstances that might give rise to a claim should be notified to insurers as soon as reasonably practicable. So it's always best to notify your D&O insurers as soon as possible. So don't delay. Also, we need a lot of information at the broker's house to pass on to insurers. So any written demands, any email exchanges, plus the names and job titles of any individuals who have been referred to in any complaints, as well as just all other information that you might have, and also any proposals for defence firms, so what their chargeable hours are, that sort of thing. And as I've just discussed, the limit, 70 million, sounds like a lot of money. Over the course of several years, that can go quite fast, and it's better to try to use insurers' own panel lawyers, because they will have negotiated lower rates, which will obviously slow down the erosion of the tower. So yeah, I will. So what I would do is I will get as much information as I can. I'll notify the primary and all of the excess insurers on a precautionary basis, and then the insurers will hopefully accept the notification and confirm whether or not the losses are covered by the policy.
And at about the same time that underwriters are getting ready to hire Laura, I'm going to be very nervous if I'm the policyholder in this circumstance, because I've got all these demands coming in, the same ones we mentioned earlier. And I've got a second problem, which is 70 million sounds like a lot of money, except when there are multiple mouths to feed. And particularly if there are conflicts of interest between the directors, so we end up with more than one set of defense counsel for the directors, or the almost inevitable conflict of interest between my client, Big Texas Oil, and its directors and officers, which requires separate counsel. We're going to again have more lawyers billing against that relatively limited fund of money, which is why 70 million sounds like a lot of money until you start spending it, particularly with a company the size of Big Texas Oil and the size of the potential ramifications depending on how much the value of its stock was affected by the charitably put misleading statements that it made about its climate goals. So with that, at this point, Laura now has the file, and Laura will tell us what she thinks.
So I've been instructed by BTO's primary insurers to investigate the availability of cover under its D&O policy in respect of the recent notification. BTO's primary D&O insurance policy is underwritten by a group of London-based insurers on a London market wording. The first point to note is that the D&O policy is subject to a clearly worded exclusive law and jurisdiction clause, which nominates the law of England and Wales as the applicable law and jurisdiction clause. So it nominates the law of England and Wales and as the applicable law of the policy, and any disputes under and in relation to the policy are to be submitted to the exclusive jurisdiction of the English courts. While this clause appears robust in its drafting and noting that it was placed in the London market with the assistance of a London broker, it should be noted that it is sometimes possible for such clauses to be the subject of challenge, whether justifiably or otherwise, dependent on the local laws of the place of the relating to the underlying event, issue, dispute, or where the insureds are domiciled. As such, this is a point which will need to be considered, and I'm planning to reach out to my colleagues in Canada and the US to get their assistance to consider whether there is any reasonable challenge to the English law, law and jurisdiction clause. But assuming that is fully robust, we proceed on the basis that English law applies. Insurers are always very keen to ensure that notification has been made in compliance with the policy terms and conditions, and particularly to understand when the relevant insureds, including the policyholder, first became aware of the matters that it is notified to ensure that all the terms and conditions have been met. As Zelda spoke to earlier, insurers will also be very keen to understand which of the insuring clauses or sections of the policy will be responding. One of the initial questions that will be asked is the extent to which BTO is able, from a legal standpoint, or indeed, and if so, willing to indemnify individual Ds and Os in relation to these matters, whether in terms of defence costs, but also substantive liability. So that is a question we will be posing to the broker. It is also a point which is relevant for the application of the retention, because to the extent that anything is not indemnified, there would be no retention, and insurers would be exposed to those costs and or losses from the ground up. So it's a point that they will want to get a handle on very, very quickly. There will also be a question around how many claims and or whether in fact what has been notified is a number of issues, some of which may be actual claims with reference to the policy wording, or whether they're in fact circumstances. And the wording that we have provides that notification can be made if there are circumstances known which may give rise to a claim which would otherwise be, if made, would be covered by the policy. So may is a very low bar for the notification of a circumstance. As to whether how many claims there are or matters are under the policy, this is likely a point which insurers will have to keep under consideration as matters progress. There are lots of different formulations of aggregation wording and policies. Some are very broad ranging and they will aggregate everything that has the same source and or originating cause. But at a much more narrow end of the fence of the spectrum, there are aggregation wordings which are much narrower and are very limited to the same sort of caused by the same event or wrongful act. In the policy that we have here, it is based upon, arising out of, based upon or attributable to any facts or wrongful acts that are the same as or related to that which were in another claim. So bearing in mind this is all derived from one particular statement, it is quite feasible that these will aggregate into one should they all become claims. Now, talking about what we've got here on our plate, it does seem that there are a number of investigations, regulatory investigations on foot. So I've been made aware that the SEC and the FTC are looking at BTO. As Zelda mentioned, there is cover under this policy for external investigation costs, but that is an entitlement only for individual directors and officers and not for the company itself. Different formulations of these insuring clauses can have different triggers, and the policy that we have here requires a D&O to be specifically identified in writing by an enforcement body or otherwise in relation specifically to SEC investigations or any state, local or foreign body with similar jurisdiction to have been in receipt of subpoena. So we will be asking whether any of those trigger events have occurred to ascertain whether the D&Os are entitled to any cover for costs arising in relation to that.
And if I can interrupt for 1 second, as the lawyer for the policyholder, this is where I'm going to push back, and I'm going to encourage underwriters to be what I will term practical, which is if we can prevent this dispute from getting into the public record in litigation, which of course is what you need for subpoenas and some of those other things that Laura has just discussed, we may be able to resolve it more cost effectively, and that strict adherence to the language of the policy may not actually be in the best interest of either Big Texas Oil or underwriters. Now, underwriters may not agree with that when the policyholder lawyer comes in and suggests it, but you can expect the policyholder lawyer to be looking at how do I solve this problem now and jump past certain steps that are set forth in the policy to simply get the money where I need it to close this down. Because as a policyholder, they just as the only good claim is a closed claim in many insurers, the policyholder in this instance wants this behind them. And the sooner it's behind them, the less harmful it is to their business in the long run. Laura?
And as insurer's representative, I would obviously note the points made by Andrew. I would ask him to submit a far more detailed briefing note on the issue with his proposals. And I do note as well that this policy does have some provision for mitigation costs cover. And it may be that there is a discussion to be had as between myself and Andrew as to whether it's triggered in the particular circumstance. And I just echoing what Andrew says, there is obviously a pragmatism that has to be applied in certain circumstances, and as that will be part of our further investigations.
And I'll be relying on the broker to make that argument as persuasively as she can.
I was just going to say, I think this is when Marsh will kind of step in and maybe make some phone calls and see what we could do to persuade insurers to be as helpful as possible. It is meant to be like a team effort to try and resolve the problem as soon as we can, and with the least pain possible.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to note in terms of it's not a necessarily adversarial discussion. Insurers have, while BTO, this might be the first time that they've been hit by this particular type of issue. Insurers who are sitting behind their D&O policy have a significant amount of, breadth and depth of experience in similar litigated matters and investigations, and that information and know-how is something that they can draw on to assist the BTO and the insureds, because they are insurers' own clients as well. But if we assume, however, that there is available, the relevant triggers in the insuring clause for investigation costs has been triggered, then there will be defence costs will be available. Obviously, we will be looking at whether there are civil or criminal investigations coming. That won't affect the availability of defence costs at this particular juncture at an early stage, but it will be something that will be considered. But that position may be different if you're looking if you've got a different applicable law. Other countries take a much more stringent approach in terms of anything relating to the costs of a criminal investigation. In terms of the threatened derivative action and or other shareholder action, for the BTO's perspective, that would be covered under side C, and to the extent any Ds and Os are brought in specifically, they would also be covered, but again, subject to whether it's indemnified or non-indemnified. But just looking in terms of the investigations themselves and the cover for fines and penalties, from a regulatory perspective, some policy wordings are very strict and exclude in totality cover for civil or criminal fines or penalties. But our policy allows cover for fines and penalties where insurable at law, and that law is the law of England and Wales. Whilst generally speaking, criminal fines and penalties are not insurable as a matter of English law, there is a large spectrum of different types of regulatory fines and penalties, and the conduct which gives rise to those fines and penalties can vary significantly, and the insurability of those under English law will be subject to a close consideration of the egregiousness of the conduct which gave rise to those penalties. So it's not yes, they're covered, no, they're not covered. It depends. So that is something that insurers will be looking at.
And if I may, there's one wrinkle to this, and this comes back to looking at your wordings very carefully, because one of the things that happens in the North American market, whether it's written here or in Bermuda or in London, is often there will be a specific clause for fines, penalties, punitive damages, etc., which provides that the law of the jurisdiction which is most favorable to insurability will govern those, notwithstanding the rest. And for example, They will often very carefully pick a jurisdiction that, unlike my home jurisdiction, where it's absolutely not insurable, they will find a jurisdiction that is willing to cover, at least in some circumstances, those expenses, plus the standard North American D&O policy, which of course we're not working on here, has a provision which obligates the insurer to defend against those claims up until there is an adjudication adverse to the policyholder of that type of conduct. And of course, that means that you're on the hook for defending. And the pressure, therefore, to save defense costs by settlement, short of that adjudication, is quite strong.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Turning now to the number of representatives, we've been told by the broker that there are potential conflicts as between some of the Ds and Os who have been identified in the regulatory investigations. Now, our policy wording provides that where there is a real conflict, just that it will insurers will agree to separate representation for each of the Ds and Os. This necessarily leads to a faster erosion of what limit is available, and it also runs the risk of duplicative work that also unnecessarily erodes, and insurers are well versed in handling and monitoring the incurring of costs in that regard, and will encourage the different law firms, once they've been agreed and their hourly rates agreed and estimates discussed and agreed, to work carefully, and where there is issues of common issues, for them to work together to try and protect the limit. So yes, insurers are very used to doing that type of work, and can also recommend and have panel insurers that they can assist when necessary.
It's also very common in North America to have joint defense agreements in circumstances like that, where the certain services, for example, the services for electronic discovery, and there would be substantial amount in a case like this, can be shared among the same group of parties. So you don't have 4 different law firms setting up their own databases of documents and conducting searches, when you can have it set up once and have everyone share the cost at a much lower overall global cost.
And
I was just sorry. I just add there that in the broking house as well, if that happens and we think there's potential conflict of interest, we'd normally have one claims advisor assigned to a client, but we'd assign as many as were necessary, and set up Chinese walls between them so that there wasn't any sharing of information on the broker side as well. And we have people who their job is to manage those conflicts of interest if that occurs. Sorry, Laura.
Yeah, that's fine. No, so insurers
I think it's
similarly.
time for us to look into the merits of this. The pension fund in Canada and BTO are facing potential liability. The question is that statement, is it false? We've all been proceeding on the assumption that it is, but in truth, is it? Is there a way out for BTO? I think it's time to look at the facts of the matter. And Andy, you wisely selected John Pacerich to be the technical advisor for BTO. John is the man to handle this issue. He advises on compliance obligations in the oil and gas, energy, and environmental areas, and he's very versed on the low carbon potential for oil and gas companies as we move forward to a low carbon economy.
And I'm going to ask Laura's clients to pay his bill, which she may not like so much.
I definitely don't.
So Andy calls, and we have an interesting discussion because there are demand letters. There are these issues that have suddenly arose, but it's important to understand that there's a huge difference between ESG reporting, which is what we've been talking about, and sustainability, right? So sustainability is people, how do you treat your people? How do you treat the planet? And then how do you manage your profit? Because sustainability should always be about making your company better, right? So if you do something for your people, how does that affect your bottom line? If you do something for the planet, how does that affect your bottom line? And they should always work together in a positive way. And so that's one of the things that we try to focus on. And so to Heather's point earlier, going back and looking at the statement, it says BTO's goal is to become a net zero emissions energy business by 2050 in step with our industry and society as a whole. Our short, medium, and long-term targets are consistent with that ambitious but essential goal. So the question then becomes, are we aspirational, which is what we need to be to meet the obligations that we have, or have we been certain? And obviously that's for the lawyers to decide. But we also have to remember that we're going to be threading the needle a little bit here, especially in a jurisdiction like Texas or some of the other what I'll call red states in the U.S., where you're going to have the Texas Attorney General who's going to be very concerned about oil and gas companies, number one, making these representations. And so the need for that PR firm quickly comes into play, because we're going to need to start threading that needle of how do we position ourselves. And since Andy's asking us to start looking at these issues, we need to think about what does that really mean. And in the oil and gas business, what it means is, we're really talking about carbon accounting at this point, but there are a lot of other environmental components to it that we can take advantage of: water stewardship, waste management, how we handle these different issues can be a real positive for the E component of ESG. We also can use these ESG metrics proactively, right? So don't forget, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to try to make our company more sustainable. We're going to try to be a better company. As we have more and more regulatory compliance obligations in the oil and gas space that overlap with our obligation in the environmental protection area, we're going to need to position ourselves effectively around, that potential transition risk, around just general liabilities associated with this industry, and some of the physical risk. And if we measure, we can then manage, and that's the key. The ESG programs are intended to give your leadership a dashboard that is simplified and understandable, so that they can monitor how they're progressing, and then we can mitigate those risks that we identify. And I think that a lot of times we have missed the boat when it comes to the ESG metrics, in not understanding that they're a ongoing obligation, that they're a management tool, and that we can use them in ways that aren't just, we're putting this out there in our annual report. I think it's a real key to start doing those things. The other thing, there's been a lot of research around ESG and how to use it to create value. And there are things that you don't really think of, because you've got E, environment, S, social, and G, governance. We actually can use this to facilitate top line growth, to reduce costs, to increase employee productivity, to optimize our investment and capital expenditures. There are lots of ways to use the data that we collect. And so as we go through this process, we are going to be touching on each of those. So here, what we have is Big Texas Oil jumped into this process feet first, and they made this very nice statement, right? But it's 2024. We now have essentially 25 years by the time we get on track to start meeting the goal by 2050. And so to start that journey of sustainability, we have to figure out a few things. Number one, we have to do a materiality assessment, and we have to understand what's important to our stakeholders. We're going to have to understand what's important to our customers, the people we're selling to. And then we're going to have to understand what's really important to the regulatory community that we work within. And part of that is, remember, I mentioned the Texas Attorney General. They are not big fans of this. So when we do these things, we have to be careful. And then we're going to have to break this all down. And we're going to have to say, okay, for our sustainability silos in the business, how are we going to take what we've now understood to be our strategic vision and integrate in our business operations these ESG metrics and obligations. And as we understand the business units that it falls within and how we're going to do it, we then have to set meaningful, measurable targets. And you heard me earlier say that Big Texas Oil is a very traditional oil and gas company. They've taken wonderful care of their employees over the years. They've been a good corporate citizen in the community. They're a significant corporate donor in the Midland, Texas area. They have wonderful reputation. And so, they have things that they've done a really good job at that we are going to emphasize, and we're going to measure those, not just on the carbon side, but we're actually going to look at it on both the social and the governance side. And then the final thing that we are going to do is we're going to collect the data. And the data collection is as important as setting the metrics, because you have to show that you are doing it consistently. You're going to pick one of like the science-based target type programs to utilize so that we can have continuity in our schemes. We will then utilize that, and we'll do a third-party verification. So if I'm doing the program creation, we're going to then have a third party essentially verify the data collection and be able to say it's a good data set. So then, the next question becomes, all right, we've now agreed to reduce these emissions. How are we going to do that? What are we going to do? And what are these? You hear me talk about scope 1, 2, and 3. Most people's eyes roll back in their head and go, what are we talking about? So it's easiest to think of them this way. Scope 1 is essentially those emissions that come directly from your company. Scope 2 is electricity and energy that it buys for that are just indirect. And then third are things in your supply chain. So for an oil and gas company, what you're talking about is, in scope 1, it's your equipment that combusts fuel, and it's equipment that emits methane to the atmosphere. It's pretty well defined for us. The oil and gas industry, honestly, has been one of the most interested businesses because they saw how big the impact it could be. So scope 1 in our business, fuel consumption from stationary engines, turbines, heaters, boilers, reboilers, flares, those typical things. But we're also going to have venting from storage tank, glycol dehydrators, vents, fugitive emissions from valves, seals, connections, pneumatic devices, pumps, and even our pipelines. We're going to have venting of carbon dioxide for things like gas sweetening units. So if we're taking that hydrogen sulfide that you heard me talk about out, we're going to have emissions associated with that. And then we're going to have fuel combustion from our pumpers. So the guys that go to the well every day and they look at it and make sure it's operating correct. The vehicles that they're running, those count in our scope 1 emissions. And then if we have things like cherry pickers and tractors and man lifts that we're using to work in our facility, that's another source of scope 1. Scope 2 emissions are those indirect purchases of electricity, heating and steam that go into our facilities from someone else. In the case of the oil and gas industry, it's not as common. It's a little bit more narrow. It's our company offices, field offices. Those are the kinds of places where we're purchasing electricity. We may also purchase some electricity for our production facilities. You can actually run a pump jack off of either gas or off of electricity. Compressor stations have some draw off for electricity, although we typically try to burn our natural gas because it's more efficient. And especially if it's in an area like Midland in the Permian Basin where we may not have pipeline capacity. And then the third is our, indirect emissions, and that's our value chain, and it's use of our product, use of the product, as we sell it. So gasoline and diesel fuel refined from our crude oil, natural gas, to the extent we can sell it, used by utilities or businesses or even homeowners. It's more complicated to figure that out. So if I want to know scope one, it's pretty easy. I go pull my utility bill. I go see how much gasoline I bought. I see how much I burned. It's pretty straightforward. Scope two gets a little more complicated to do that. By the time you get to scope three, we're essentially guessing. And I don't mean that in a disrespectful way, but we're essentially using guidance from other sources to say, if you're this big and you have this many profit dollars in this industry, then your scope three is X. If you buy this much fuel, your scope three is Y. And so I think what we find is there are a lot of opportunities here for challenge. And we try to tighten up these programs, because here, the reason that Big Texas Oil is in trouble is because they have a very general statement and they have very general ideas. So, when Andy calls, I'm going to look at what do they have? What are we going to need to rework? And then what's the plan going to be to move forward so that we can be a responsible part of the community and help Andy get Big Texas Oil out of trouble with the SEC and Chase and the Federal Trade Commission and the pension fund, and all while staying in Laura's good graces and making sure that Zelda's not unhappy because we didn't do something right. So a week goes by and we've been talking on and off. I call Andy and I say to him, well, we have a plan, but it's going to be expensive. And we're going to have to completely redo our existing sustainability reporting, because we're going to now thread the needle. We're going to need to start addressing the concerns that have been raised. One of the things we're going to do immediately is we're not going to be a pure play oil and gas company anymore. We're going to start looking at ways to, over the next 25 years, remove carbon and address our ongoing obligations. So we look at things like carbon capture. How do we take CO2 out of our stationary sources? So in the oil and gas business, we have a long history of this. These projects have been going on for more than 50 years. We capture CO2 from another industrial source. So for example, a real common way to do this is to find a large industrial source like a fertilizer plant. They have tons of CO2 emissions. We can capture that CO2, clean it up, and pipe it to the field, and then that comes in enhanced oil recovery, and we actually put it back into the field and use that CO2 to increase the oil production. So we actually get a financial benefit, plus we get a CO2 benefit. We can do other things like utilize it. We can convert it into other fuels. We can convert it into other chemistries. We can use it in the cement manufacturing process. There are things now that are called direct air capture. If you've seen in the news, there's a facility that actually takes it out of the air directly just as the wind blows it over it and captures it, and then ultimately sequesters it in a geologic formation. They even have some other types of geologic sequestration where you take it out of the air through one of these direct air captures, and then you inject it into the rock, and it actually reacts with the rock and it gets trapped there forever instead of being in a abandoned oil formation. So there's lots of opportunities for carbon capture, and BTO is going to have to look at each one. So that's part of the plan. Another part of the plan is Andy and I become a road show. We suddenly are traveling. We're going to see Chase, and we're going to sit down and we're going to walk through our plan, and we're going to help them understand how our plan complies with the rules, and we're going to help them understand how our plan complies with meeting this 2020 or 2050 goal, excuse me. And we're going to walk them through it. We're going to go see the Federal Trade Commission and the SEC, and we're going to try to keep them off of our back. We're going to go talk to Heather. We're going to work with each of the groups that's concerned with us. I don't have a lot of hope that we're going to get the Sierra Club off of our back, but we're going to work with everybody else. So this image shows some of the things that we'll be looking at. We'll be looking at wind farms. We're looking at transmission lines. How do we blend this combination of resource opportunities that we have? Because we're a large, medium-sized independent oil and gas company in Texas. We have rights to lots of land. We can put things up and figure out ways to really expand our footprint while conserving our profit margin. Because at the end of the day, a sustainability plan has to do that. It has to let you continue to be a business. If you were going to simply say, in 2050, we're going to meet our obligation, well, Andy and I decide in 2049, we're simply going to hand the keys into the bankruptcy court and say, we're done. And so, we meet our emissions requirements. That's not going to make anybody happy. So let's go to the next slide. So we're going to transition Big Texas Oil from a pure play oil and gas company to a large scale renewable developer. We're not going to get completely out of the oil and gas business. We're going to continue to do that, but we're going to use all of these other technologies that are available to us. We're going to do things like direct air capture. We're going to do carbon sequestration. We're going to do, like I mentioned earlier, solar and wind. We're going to take each of those. We're going to start capturing, for example, our flaring. And instead of flaring it, we're going to either re-inject it to avoid that emission, or we're going to burn it, but we're still going to have an emission factor, but we're going to be able to run some of our equipment and we're going to reduce our footprint in other ways. This is a sophisticated approach. We're going to have to come up with ways to explain to Chase, who has obligations around finances, that we're going to be financially viable for a long time. Andy's going to have to explain to the FTC and SEC that we are meeting the requirements of our obligations to them, which are different. And I think that what you will find is there's lots of opportunities here for improvement. There's the technology available to do it, and we'll be able to make these people happy, but it is not a 6-month fix. As Laura rightly pointed out, and Zella pointed out, these are long-term obligations. That $70 million is going to be spread out over a period of time, and we're going to have to manage this on the front end really carefully. As we get further and further away from today, hopefully we've set up a good program so that in the last 5 or 10 years, we're actually ahead of schedule. We'll be checking those metrics every month. We'll know where we are in that program, but it will be a very long-term approach. These are not things that you set it and forget it, so to speak.
Well, and from the client's perspective, this all is extremely expensive.
Yes, sir.
And I don't think that Laura's clients are going to pay to have this done. This isn't part of what they pay under a D&O policy. But when I spend this money, I have to avoid future claims against the next year's D&O policy, which I'm sure will be far more expensive. I need to be able to sell the markets, the investors who own my shares, that the capital that I'm investing in this is going to make BTO a better company, not just this year and next year, but or 2050, but in 2070, because it is evolving and adapting, and it is not going the way of, blacksmiths and horse stables and other 19th century industries that disappeared with the advent of the internal combustion engine.
And Andy, to your point, what we're seeing is we're seeing the largest of these companies today making those transition moves. That, you know, BP, Exxon, they all have very significant investments in the renewable energy space. These are things that Chase understands and has significant investment dollars put into these programs. And what you'll find is, you know, Google, Amazon have invested hundreds of millions, now billions of dollars in these technologies because they know this is coming. And eventually, you know, even as somebody who's worked in the oil and gas industry now for almost 35 years, what I find is the marketplace is much more tolerable of the idea. There are very, very few pure play oil and gas companies out there of any size. If a big Texas oil wants to grow and expand and actually be able to access the financial markets, they're going to have to show that their long-term revenue growth is not based solely on their reservoir reports. They're going to have to show we have a plan that we can execute and we can generate profit dollars with something other than pumping it out of the ground. And so, you know, wind and solar and other opportunities, for example, one of the oil and gas companies has set up an entire subsidiary that is entirely organized around producing a green barrel of oil. They're investing enough dollars in the renewables, in the sequestration, in the technology to be able to say, when we produce this barrel of oil, we can show that we have more carbon removed from the environment than we're putting back into it. These are incredibly attractive to the financial markets despite the cost.
Well, Andy and John came to see me and my client, and we were impressed. What I was listening for is the verifiable performance indicators to indicate that this plan has been accepted by the board of BTO, that there's funding for it, and that it's going to proceed. Because the investigator for the Competition Bureau is looking at that, looking for truth for the statement. Where's the action to support that statement? And if we can show that BTO is transforming, is meeting this target, and has a reasonable chance of being net zero by 2050, then they'll stand down their investigation and their pressure on my company is off. And if that pressure leaves, then the potential of backlash from our investors in the form of any type of action against our investors or against our D&O and our officers is going to lessen. It's not going to go away, but the threat is going to diminish. All of which means that this draft statement of claim that I sent to Andy against BTO and each of its officers and directors can stay a draft. And I'm going to be watching BTO's performance and its ability to meet these performance indicators with significant attention. John, this is an amazing plan. Andy?
And Heather, I think the thing it does for the pension fund is it lets them keep the investment, right? I mean,
Yes.
it does the thing which the pension fund most wants, which is to be able to show it is also being
Supportive of it.
respectful and
Yeah.
and it's being supportive of what its own customers. The pension fund has these goals and drivers that it has to meet. It's going to need someone like a big Texas Oil to make these transitions because their customers, their clients expect the same.
Yeah. So my insurers are happy. They're of course keeping an open file, but their concern is of a potential claim is lessened. They think it's well in hand. I'm not looking at the pressure from our pensioners that I once was. So I'm good. And Andy, you need to keep the defense of all of these claims within that 70 million so that you've got the operating cash to implement this plan.
Just to be clear, I don't think this plan would be covered by the policy, even though the policy does cover mitigation costs. In case anybody was getting excited about that. You could try it, but I don't think you would succeed.
And Zelda, they
I-
might cover some
I
of the
wouldn't
planning
expect to.
component. I think, you know, the best hope you've got is they might cover some of the planning component, right? The implementation, they clearly aren't going to cover, but the development of some of the plan, they might, you might twist their arm a little bit and get a little help there.
Well, if I were
it would
if I were
require
re-
understanding.
if I
I think
really were BTO, I would also be moving as much of that consultant work, which is fundamentally what it is
Absolutely.
consultant work. I would be moving that into my defense costs. I would be arguing this is what my D's and O's and my company needs to be able to be positioned to defend against these claims. And if there is an incidental benefit that the company can now take advantage of this work product and do what it should have done in the first place, well, that just kind of happens that way. Not that that's going to make underwriters feel very comfortable about what I've just done.
I think probably the best takeaway would be it would have been better if they did this in 2022 when they made the initial representation, and then all of this could have been avoided.
Laura's
Yes.
being noticeably silent.
We don't live in a perfect world. And if we did, we'd all have different jobs.
It would be a very big debate to be had, but I'm with Zelda on this. I think this is an incredible stretch of any mitigation cover. But obviously it will ultimately depend on the policy wording.
Stepping
You
out of
may
character,
even
I
get
completely
pushback
agree.
You may get pushback from the directors and officers because you're using up their limit to pay for a strategic change in direction for the company.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
The
But
only
we can have
problem is
that
they're the
argument.
ones that suggested the 2050 in the beginning. They should have just kept their mouth shut, I think. But oh well.
This is why litigators should read your statements before you make them, so they can spot problems.
Well, and I think that's really one of the points, right? Is we've seen an increase in the overall litigious nature around this issue. As in the U.S., we've seen more kind of politicalization of the issues around sustainability. There are, attorney general's offices that have taken a role in it that they frankly don't have much of a role, in my opinion. You've seen the Democrats and the Republicans both complain about how that gets done, and it doesn't matter which side you're on, both of them have a different opinion. And then you have, especially if you start talking about multinationals, where you have operations in the EU where there are very strict and very well-defined obligations. And then you come to the US and the SEC has rules, but their current rule specific to this has been delayed for a significant period of time. You're going to have real conflict in your regulatory environment that can potentially put you at risk. I'm beginning to wonder if the insurers, as they're placing these programs, be it D&O or whatnot, are not going to look and go, maybe we, as part of our underwriting process, need to look at these companies' programs a little bit to understand, are there metrics, just some simple things. Do they even have metrics that we could potentially look at? And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
We definitely do advise clients to speak to their carbon goals and their sustainability goals. But what I would always say is it's best not to overpromise and underdeliver, which is obviously what we've been talking about. So don't say 2030 net carbon zero if that's not achievable. And also you need to say what steps you're taking and how far along the road you are and where you see the future going. But insurers are really interested in that. And in the UK, for example, the Competition and Markets Authority can now fine companies, I think, or soon will be able to, up to 10% of turnover for breach of consumer law, and that includes greenwashing, so breach of the green code. So, there is a regulatory threat out there if companies are misrepresenting their green credentials. And yeah, I think we will see more claims in this area.
Well,
I know
one of the
HSBC
weaknesses of this in the US is we have a federal system of government where each state has areas that are within its jurisdiction, either independent of or in addition to what's the federal government can do. And attorneys general in the United States for the individual 50 states are almost all, there are one or two states that are exceptions, elected officials. And those that are not elected officials are appointed by the governor. I know that's true in Hawaii because I know the former Hawaii Attorney General. And the result of that is they often take positions judged somewhat not just by their legal merits, but by their political merits. So you get a state which is very anti-ESG, such as the current government in Texas. They're going to take one position, whereas I live in California, where the political climate is the opposite. They're going to take a different position. And as a business person, this is challenging because it increases the unpredictability and uncertainty of the environment in which I do business. And as much as I hate being told I have to do something I don't want to do, I hate even more the unpredictability of not knowing what I have to do.
Yeah. I think that's when things like greenwashing play out, isn't it? When people are just trying to keep quiet to try and avoid riling anybody, but then you can get in trouble for greenwashing as well.
Yeah, I think both the greenwashing and green hushing issues are going to be the biggest risks because all the companies now have some sustainability component, right? It doesn't matter how big they are or how small, they almost all have something. And the greenwashing is very easy to find yourself in that spot because my interpretation of the wording and your interpretation of the wording can be very different. For example, Coca-Cola got in trouble for the way it talked about its bottle recycling. Well,
yeah.
It can be very different. Heather.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that these claims are definitely on the rise in Canada. The Competition Bureau is being extremely aggressive in chasing down the truth behind these statements, and they're investigating. They are laying civil claims. And as I said at the outset, they even have the ability to contact the Director of Public Prosecutions for individual provinces and lay criminal charges for particularly egregious conduct. So there is from the regulatory point of view, there's pressure. There's also shareholder derivative actions allowable in Canada. This is a growing market. This is a significant risk to business of all stripes, but particularly those who are involved in oil and gas. Our D&O policies are more in Canada are more North American model, more similar to what you would find in the US. But not entirely. And if your parent company is based in Europe and particularly in the UK, you're going to get UK wording very similar to that which Laura discussed. So you're going to have jurisdictional issues. All of this is to say that every single issue we discussed today is relevant in the Canadian environment. It's relevant in the US environment, and it's highly relevant in the UK and the EU.
And Heather, it's interesting because like in the US, the SEC, everybody says, oh, well, they have their rule coming. They have an existing set of rules that they've used for enforcement of these very issues. Vale, the big Brazilian miner, paid a significant fine over misreporting its dam safety programs. And so there are existing tools in the toolbox in the US that have been used. And I think what we'll see is if eventually there will be a federal rule. Andy in California has a rule that was passed in their Senate, passed their legislature. I guess it's last year now. It's been challenged, of course, but they have a rule, and it's very closely mirrored on what's going on in the EU. And California has always been a leading indicator in this arena, and that rule will eventually come out. They completely have the right to implement that rule. And I think what you'll see is eventually this will come to the U.S. As a national program. It's just a matter of time, and finding the political environment that's ready to receive it. Because the businesses already are. The businesses are all doing it. It's a political shell game at this point.
Well, and that one of the things that happens is that you also have to look at the economic might of the particular jurisdiction.
Yep.
Both Texas and California have, I think California would be the 5th largest country in the world in terms of GDP if it were an independent nation. Texas is not far behind, and so both of those end up driving the marketplace, regardless of what other jurisdictions in North America really feel should be done. But that's a practical problem. That's not really an insurance. It's an insurance problem because that's part of the world we as insurance lawyers live in. So,
To our audience, if you have questions to any of us, please put them in this chat or email any of us, and we will answer them on LinkedIn. And keep the discussion on this very important topic going. I like to take this opportunity to thank this panel. The time that was spent putting this together, thinking through the issues, we had fun doing it, but the time that people devoted to this, took it out of their busy schedules. I just want to thank each and every one of you for doing that. I think we all learned a lot from each other, and we're going to continue to learn from each other as we together move through these issues. And as you can see, they're international in scope, and we need to lean on the international panel that we have here, as well as the groups that each one of us know through our professional associations throughout the world as we jointly deal with these emerging issues. Thank you to FOIL. Thank you for Canadian Defence Lawyers for hosting us. This has been terrific. Have a great day.
thank you.
Enjoyed it
Thank you
very
very
much.
much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.